So I'm going to give you a bit of a background about the older age group and then tell you specifically about this project which we're just getting going with, which I think you'll find interesting. These publications here you may have seen. Pavilion, I'll just do a little plug for this, Susie. Pavilion produced absolutely wonderful, accessible resources which relate to a very practical way of working effectively with autistic people. And I'm sure Susie will be talking about her book about autism and mental well-being in higher education. But these two publications here, is Damien in the room? Well, you know Damien. Damien and I have edited these two special editions for Pavilion on autism and intellectual disability in adults. There have been 2 volumes of these. And the beginning of this presentation relates to research which Joe and I produced for the 2nd edition of this autism and intellectual disability in adults. Look at the Pavilion website, it's actually really good in terms of resources. One of the things which we find problematic is that they are a bit expensive, but if you're attached to the university, you never pay for things. For academic resources, that's one of the things which is a benefit of being either a student or somebody who's a researcher or working at university. So you can get hold of these. Anyway, from the paper that Joe and I produced last year, just a little bit of background. There's very little research about autism and intellectual impairment in later life, and that is a concern. Where do you turn to for advice? How do you know if services are any good? And it's this whole idea about living life right to the end, living life to the full, right to the end. But there are many parents and extended family members who are responsible for trying to support an autistic family member who has additional impairments such that they can't live independently, who just are feeling worried about what's going to happen next, and particularly what's going to happen after they're not there, not around to support that person anymore. So advanced planning is obviously a good idea, but looking into what might be out there can feel like staring into the void and really can create anxiety for people trying to plan ahead. Anxiety is well founded really, as provision is limited, there seems to be little political will to change this situation, despite equalities and autism legislation which aim to improve the quality of life for autistic and disabled people throughout life. I just want to take this life course approach, autistic children become autistic adults.
Well, they are meant to extend the autism strategy to include children, so you are going to kind of blur it more to what children tend to do.
Yeah, exactly. So there'll inevitably be ageing autistic plus. Well, I'm using the term autistic plus now because I can't keep saying autistic people with additional intellectual impairments. So if you're happy with the autistic plus shorthand, that's what I'm going to go with. Who've never had the opportunity to access a diagnosis and the notional legal protection that this may afford. So this is obviously an issue. We all know that adult diagnosis is an issue, and older adults may have never had that opportunity, so that can be really problematic. Some generic information about medical, social, emotional, practical aspects of aging may be useful, but it's essential to think specifically about what might be helpful for older autistic plus people with lifelong or acquired cognitive difficulties and barriers to communication. So people change as they age as well, and it may be that people acquire additional impairments in older age, which is something also needs to be considered. Everything I say is very much from a social model perspective, which is really emphasising individuality, trying to put to one side any stereotypes, including things like making heteronormative assumptions. Some autistic people are gay. Some older autistic people are gay. Who knew? It's just that thing that we don't want a stereotypical view of autism and of old age when we're looking at this. And listening to autistic people obviously underpins all the research we do. And those of you that don't know about the Participatory Autism Research Collective, this is going to keep coming up through the day. That's basically autistic people and allies meeting together, working together to inform autism research. And within our research group, we don't do any autism research without autistic researchers, nothing about us without us. That's a principle. And that's a principle I would like to see in all autism research.
Can I just ask a very quick question?
Yeah, sure.
What does that look like for BAME persons also? BAME autistic persons?
Well, in the research that we are doing now from Northern Wind, we're going to partner actually with Autism Voice, because we're going to look at the experience of autistic plus older people in London and in a sort of out of London community. So that obviously will have a very, very strong BAME focus. In relation to how many people from BAME backgrounds are within the park, I haven't got that information at my fingertips, but Autism Voice is very closely aligned to PARC.
I think that's critical information that is needed up front, to be honest with you. If we're talking about allyship and helpfulness, I don't think it's really best practice to say, well, that's somebody else's. I think if we can have it up front, that would be really helpful.
Well, I'm not saying that, but the thing is, PARC is a very, very loose collective, and the reason I can't say all these people are in PARC is because I don't have a list of members of PARC. Because if you want to be in PARC, you can be in PARC. But if one of the outcomes of this symposium can be to try and look at those demographics, because I completely agree with you. Richard, I'm not going to answer all your questions because I'm not going to get through it.
For autism underdiagnosed and BAME groups. So that might be a contributing factor for us.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, so individuals experience the limitations of old age at different stages in their life course, depending on factors like their physical fitness, activity levels, community participation, etc. But milestones like retirement, death of a parent, they're useful life course markers. But of course, if somebody has been disenfranchised from the world of employment, the life course marker of retirement isn't necessarily something which is within their life experience. So the NES did something in 2013, a campaign called Getting On, Growing Older with Autism. And this is just a key quote from that. Aging people need to be able to talk about their health. We did a piece of research with the Westminster Westminster Commission for Autism, and we became very aware from that piece of research that access to healthcare, annual health checks and everything else for disabled people, particularly people with intellectual impairments, is particularly limited. And although there's an entitlement, doesn't mean it actually happens in practice, so that's quite a problematic thing. So, don't fall into the trap of assuming that it's always the autistic person who is the recipient of care. This is another thing from another family member. Aging autistic carers, including autistic parents or autistic adult children, receive absolutely no research attention. We don't have a crystal ball, so we don't know what people in that category are going to want if we're not asking them. We've got no accurate information about how many old people are on the spectrum, because it wasn't until the 1940s that the first generation of children which received an autism diagnosis. So it's only relatively recently that people diagnosed with autism are moving into old age. So it's quite a difficult research area particularly. But within research that I've been involved in before, both at Cambridge with Simon Baron-Cohen working with autistic students, and this research, a clinically recognised diagnosis of autism is not going to be necessary to participate in this research, because that's a massive barrier to people who don't have a clinically recognised diagnosis of autism. If you identify as autistic, that's actually good enough for our research, and that's within our proposal. I'm going to get through some more before I take any more questions. So, the thing about additional communication challenges developing in old age, for example, if somebody has a stroke or something like that, can be a factor. Elderly parents may be the conduit to communication, and they may acquire communication impairments themselves. So all these factors are really important. And any situation which relies on a very old person caring for an old person without support is obviously not sustainable, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. We just don't have reliable figures. And there's this thing about we always just manage. That thing is very, very hard to get a real picture of what's actually going on in the community. Okay? There's some evidence of premature mortality for people with intellectual impairments, but you just really need to assume that most autistic people will live to an age at which some form of geriatric support will be required. And that all these sort of things which happen to all of us in later life, we have to think about how these play out for autistic people. Loss, bereavement, issues to do with sexuality, etc., etc. We need to think about autism through the life course and be really aware of this sort of thing. And bereavement extends beyond family relationships as well. It's always easy to say that person is going to be upset because their brother or sister has died. That person might have a very, very close friend that they lose and will be very, very upset. Unless you know, and you know, unless you're thinking about it, you might not really be addressing those concerns in a sensitive way. And there is some evidence that professionals have made assumptions about people from BAME communities continuing to be supported by extended families following the death of parents, which has led to people from BAME communities being less likely to receive external services. There's some evidence, but that can't be an assumption that you make that, oh, in BAME communities, the community is strong and they support that person. That's a dangerous reminder. Service providers should not assume that all families originating from BAME backgrounds have extended social support networks, or that everyone is heterosexual or gender conformist, or indeed that autistic people are asexual. Sometimes that happens. Or like Greta Garbo, we don't want these assumptions to be made. We want to avoid stereotypes, as I've said before. So, here you are, we've got Public Health England 2014 report making reasonable adjustments to end-of-life care for people with learning disabilities is relevant. It's got an easy-read version. This thing about discussing and planning for the future before the future becomes present is very important. And what parents say is, I'm really worried about what's going to happen when I die, and actually have a real gap in support about where to turn to answer that question. So further development of services which can meet the specific requirements of older autistic adults with intellectual impairments is necessary, as the current generic model often doesn't meet their needs, including palliative care services. And obviously, autistic people are best placed to advise on what this might look like. You can have one minute round away from palliative care to be quite positive about this whole thing about being active in later life, community participation, healthy living and all that sort of thing. It's not just about putting a sticking plaster on a difficult situation and assuming there is a difficult situation. It's very often about enhancing the care and support that that older autistic person likes, requires, by giving them opportunities to do things that they like in the community. Very much our London project, which I'm talking about in a minute, focuses on that. And the barriers to that sort of community participation are often about poor understanding of the autistic person and lack of support to engage with the sort of activities that can make the lives of older people rich. So an autistic older person who has an in-depth interest in something could access provision in the community which would enable them to explore that in-depth interest if they were supported to do so. And if people just make an assumption, oh, old people just stay at home and don't really have interest and all that sort of thing, that's going to be a barrier in itself. So there's a whole range of barriers, and this is what our research wants to look at. Okay, so consideration of autistic older people might want to think about their own mortality, what happens when they die, what they want to do with their possessions and all that sort of thing. That's something which is quite often just ignored. It's too difficult to discuss. How you communicate with somebody about concepts which are really difficult to grasp is another consideration there. I'm not going to go through all these slides in depth because you get the slides afterwards. NAS has done a little bit of work on this, useful questionnaire looking at bereavement, finance legal arrangements, supportive relationships, parents and carers' wishes, views about death, useful resources for older autistic people, and you can have a look at those resources as well. Just a little plug for PARC, of course, here is really important. And this is what we're doing now. So that's a bit of background. Very quickly, in the next 5 minutes, this is what we're doing. Joe, Eddie and I at the moment, but we also have already appointed 2 autistic researchers, but we can't tell you their names because they haven't, it's not in public domain yet, but it was a condition of the funding and very strong point in our bid. Okay, so we're looking at autistic adults over 44 with additional impairments, autistic plus with the arcade autistic researchers, leading to practical recommendations of use in the community.
Can I ask why specifically 44?
Because the fund has said 44.
Do you know why?
No. Good question.
It's slightly
I know,
arbitrary.
44 seems quite young to be old, doesn't it?
Yeah.
44 is the,
It might be due to the mortality rate from the Sweden study from like 2016.
maybe, I don't know.
The mortality rate for autistic people with epilepsy was like 36 or 38.
It could be.
And it was like 56 or 58 for.
Yeah, good point. It could be that I just don't know. So this is what we're going to do. Find out what's available from the statutory sector, charities and in the community. So we're going to look at local authority, health service websites and so on. And you know, charity blurb and all that sort of thing. So we'll see what Age Concern says, for example, about autism, probably nothing, you know, things like that. And then find out what's available, and then find out what's missing, i.e. what people would like that they don't get. And then, having done that bit of desktop research, we're going to try out and evaluate some small-scale activities which participants identify, and out of all that, create recommendations for improvement, create a resource guide and all this. This is going to take us a couple of years. So, for example, if somebody says, you know, I'd like to be in touch with people on social media or WhatsApp or Facebook, whatever it is, but I don't know how to use it, that could be the sort of intervention we could try out. Or if somebody says, actually, I would like somebody to come to my home and be with my autistic son and daughter so that I can go out and do this, you know, there's all that sort of stuff. Just very, very small scale interventions, try them out, see if they're any good, and build them into recommendations. Because there's no magic money tree, and we know statutory services are not doing enough, haven't got enough money, and we know that charities very often ignore sort of outliers like autistic people or whatever it is. So Age Concern very much coalesces around acquired impairment that you acquire with age, and tend to ignore people who've had an impairment in the first place, for example. So we're going to have a good crawl over the websites and see what's going on in terms of our initial research, okay? We're also going to, in addition to practical questions about social support, participants will be asked about their well-being at the start of the project. And later on in the project, we're going to ask participants about their well-being again, to see if anything has shifted. So with the parents, we have got something, so it's like an instrument, a sort of wheel, where you mark off how happy you are in different dimensions with your health, with your social support, with your employment, whatever it is. That works fine for people who don't have additional communication impairments. We also need to find a way of engaging with understanding about the well-being of the autistic participants who have intellectual impairments as well, so may have communication difficulties. And one of our people who recently acquired a PhD has been working on just that, Dr. Sally Brett, so she'll be helping us with that. Okay? In terms of social support, we're going to ask what's happening in your community to support older autistic plus people and their family carers, what's not happening but would be actually really useful, and how could this support be provided and who should be responsible. And you know, it could be things as simple as we'd love to be able to go to the cinema. They don't have relaxed performances in our cinema. We really think if they did. Just anything like that. Anything really. We want to know about what worries autistic plus older people and family carers, what might alleviate these worries, what would enhance quality of life for autistic plus people and family, and how might the ideas for enhancing quality of life be organised, and who should be responsible for this, and also thinking all the time about how these interventions we described could be sustainable.